Okay, good morning. Welcome to today's webinar, Rapidly Changing Pharmacy Benefits, a Lehigh Valley Case Study. I'm Amanda Green, Director of Operations for the Coalition. Just a few pieces of housekeeping before we kick off today's presentation. Today's session is being recorded and all of our attendees are in listen-only mode. We will post this to lvbch.com under past events for viewing after the fact. Please remember to check your Zoom toolbar. If we have any announcements, we'll send them to you using the chat function. All questions should be submitted using the Q&A from the toolbar. We do have a portion of our session later reserved for that question and answer time, and we'll do a moderated session. So I'll be handing it off now to Carl Seitz, President of the Coalition, for welcoming remarks. Thank you.
Morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We're doing a program today, a case study on a actual audit that was done in the Lehigh Valley, and it's an audit that was done in Lehigh County. There's always a sensitivity, if I can put it that way, when you're talking about some of the issues we're going to talk about today with this audit. But I just want to be clear that we're not here to criticize or question anyone or any employer. Our purpose here is to present what we thought was a great learning opportunity. And all the information you're seeing is in the public domain. So the audit and the high-level discussion of the situation was published in Modern Healthcare. So, and it was also in the local newspapers. So I just wanted to, open up with those thoughts as we move forward. But we do think there's great learning opportunity here. Things like discussing pharmacy costs, carving in versus carving out, transparency of data. I'm always hearing things about who owns the data. It's the employer's data, and things like pharmacy contracting. And then we also are including something on the Consolidated Appropriations Act, which has several reporting and disclosure requirements that we felt relate to the case. So, Amanda, next slide. What I want to do just briefly before we get into the program is just discuss the Coalition's 41st Annual Conference, which is coming up on May 4th, 5th, and 6th. You can see the theme of the conference there, and what we're doing this year, we're doing a virtual conference, 2 hours each day. And we have a specific theme for each day, which you can see: the future of healthcare, the future of benefits, and the future of mental health. Next slide, please. Each day the conference is going to open up with a half hour of networking on the Remo platform, which we've used several times this year and gotten great response to, and we're using that in place of in-person networking. We have two keynote presenters, Don Berwick, who is opening up the conference on May 4th with a great presentation on the moral determinants of health. Don is the former administrator of the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. And then on Thursday, we have Craig Kramer, who is a fantastic speaker to talk about the mental health moment. Next slide, please. And then in addition to the keynotes, we have a number of panels throughout the 3 days. I won't go into everything specifically there. And all this information is going to come out today or tomorrow. So you'll be seeing it and have more time to look at it. But you can see there, it's 3 days, 2 keynotes, 4 panels, 20 plus speakers, 20 sponsors, networking on the Remo platform. We think it's going to be a great event, and want to encourage everyone to attend. If you haven't registered, please do. Next slide. I want to thank our presenters today. We have a great lineup of presenters, folks that are really experienced in the area of pharmacy benefits. As usual, I'm not going to go into specifics on each one. You have that information on the invite. You have their bios. But I want to thank them for taking the time to be with us today and look forward to hearing their presentation. Next slide. And I'm going to turn it over now to Scott Fair, who's the Vice President for Benefits Consulting with USI Insurance Services, and he's also the coalition consultant. Yeah, Scott's worked with us, and I think he's well known to everyone, but he's worked with us on almost all of our RFPs other than pharmacy. And he's been a great partner for me in the 4 years I've been here with the coalition. I really value the partnership with him and the expertise he brings to the coalition and our members. So Scott, I'll turn things over to you.
Great. Thanks, Carl. It's my pleasure to be here today and to make some, very brief opening comments. As Carl indicated, an employer in the Lehigh County, it actually was the county of Lehigh, recently did an audit. You can go to the next slide, Amanda. Recently did an audit of its prescription drug program. So they're a self-funded employer. They use Highmark as their medical third-party administrator, and their prescription drug benefit was carved in with Highmark. So they were using Express Scripts as their PBM, but they were accessing ESI or Express Scripts through Highmark. They took a look at, they audited the 2019 plan year, and the overall goal of the audit was to evaluate cost controls that Highmark had in place, looking at things like the amount that they were actually, the county was being charged for prescription drugs, how competitive that arrangement was. They also looked at the rebate structure. In their agreement with Highmark, they were guaranteed a fixed rate rebate amount, and they wanted, the auditor looked at how much the county actually received versus what in total Highmark received in rebates. And they looked at a number of other things as well. And I guess when they published the results, which again, as Carl indicated, got picked up by a couple different media outlets, including Modern Healthcare, the conclusion from the auditor was basically that, hey, the county probably needs to renegotiate its PBM arrangement with Highmark, or perhaps carve out the prescription drug benefit and negotiate a direct deal with the PBM. But in other words, they basically concluded that the arrangement was not as competitive as it could be. In particular, they projected that they may have overpaid to the tune of $650,000 for a sampling of drugs that they were able to perform an audit on. Again, that would be for the 2019 plan year. In addition, the auditors felt that for that year, they probably left about another $700,000 in rebate dollars on the table. So again, their conclusion was that the arrangement was not as competitive as it could be. I would say those of us that are in the employee benefits consulting space were not necessarily surprised that a carved-in arrangement like the county had may not be as competitive as some other arrangements. Of course, and also not surprising, Highmark definitely is disputing the findings and disagrees with some of the conclusions that were released in that audit report. But as Carl indicated in his opening comments, that's really not, we're not here to be critical of Highmark or, the arrangement that the County of Lehigh had. We're using this kind of as an opportunity to kind of just, educate employers and, and maybe offer some lessons learned from this. One other, I guess, key finding from the audit report, the auditor felt like there wasn't enough access to information in order to effectively actually perform that audit. So they were, I think, a bit frustrated with the level of transparency and access to actual claims and pricing information. So I guess, from our perspective, I think this whole arrangement or the audit kind of underscores for employees the importance of really gaining greater control over prescription benefit. And our speakers today have a number of strategies that they're going to share related to exactly that. How can employers get greater control? And I would, for any of the employers that are in the audience today, if you have a self-funded plan and your prescription drug benefit is carved in with your medical TPA, I would highly encourage you to evaluate carving out that drug benefit. And I would also suggest, if you haven't looked at the coalition's PBM arrangements they've negotiated through their group purchasing partners, they've negotiated very favorable PBM contracts with both Express Scripts and Welldyne, leveraging the collective side of the coalition members. So if you haven't looked at the coalition PBM arrangements, I would also suggest that would probably be something that you should consider in the future. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Ann Ladd to kick off the presentations for today. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks very much. Hi, everybody. Nice to meet you all virtually. You want to go ahead to the next slide, Amanda? Go ahead and keep going. Next one. Just so you know, I am a reformed reporter. And as a reporter, I learned to follow the dollar. And it has served me well as I try to navigate the convoluted, obscure healthcare system. And so I'm going to hit you first with some somewhat discouraging thoughts. And I'm going to share with you something you probably already know, which is the entire system is pretty much rigged against you. Most all the incentives of all the intermediaries are designed to benefit them, not you. And large employers who thought that, large and small employers, who thought that their intermediaries were working on their behalf have kind of come to this realization, and it's kind of gobsmacked them. It's nearly a $3.5 trillion business that's working against you, and it is a very effective machine. But remember the golden rule, and the golden rule is he who holds the gold makes the rules, and you guys as employers and payers hold the gold, and you can make the rules. You are quite powerful in this arena, and I'd want you to sort of know that. All right, Amanda, next slide. So if you look at the industry today, you're going to see a great deal of consolidation. All the big carriers are vertically integrated with their insurer, the PBM, specialty pharmacy, and provider services. So they will say to you that, well, this better consolidation means a better patient experience, better outcomes, better efficiency, and better pricing. But I think that that is yet to be proven. And as the black box gets bigger, we have less transparency, and the industry exerts greater control. And I think there is a tremendous potential for a great many negative impacts for employers. So I think keeping your eye on consolidation is a really important thing for you to do. Next slide, please. So let's look at PBMs. PBMs first emerged in the 1980s, and they kept telling us that they were going to help us drive down costs. But the question is, are they? In the past decade, the pharmacy space has changed dramatically. Even 3 to 5 years ago, it wasn't such a big problem. It was maybe 8% of your medical spend. But now it's probably more than double that. There's some concern about, back then there was some concern about brand drugs getting more expensive, but we hadn't seen the $100,000, $500,000, $1 million drugs hit the marketplace. And we need to be mindful of that. And I want to explain to you, and I hope this isn't too basic, but I want to walk you through the complex supply chain that includes a lot of intermediaries, so you can kind of maybe understand how the system is once again stacked against you. So next slide, please. I just want to start with an overview. This is the big picture, and it's a really busy slide. And what I'm going to do is spend the next few minutes breaking it down and building it back up so you can follow those arrows a little bit easier. So next, please. So here are the players. The players are the manufacturer, the wholesaler, the pharmacy, the patient, the beneficiary, the employer, and the PBM. And it starts with your employee or family member who pays their premium contribution to you, the employer and plan sponsor. That's the first arrow. Next one. And then what happens is they need a prescription. So they go to the pharmacy down the street and they pay a copay or co-insurance for that prescription and get their drugs. And from their point of view, that seems pretty simple and straightforward. But it's kind of like, the Wizard of Oz, what's behind the curtain? And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Go ahead, next, please. In order for the drug to get to the pharmacy, the drug has to get there. It has to physically be at the pharmacy. And to get the drug, they go to a wholesaler like McKesson or AmerisourceBergen. And those two organizations are the main ones. They deliver the actual physical drug to the pharmacy. And of course, there are profits for the wholesaler in that transaction. In fact, some of these are paid as a percent of drug. So some are incentivized to use to get the pharmacy to use a more expensive drug, to stock a more expensive drug if they are paid percent of drug cost or reimbursed that way. Next slide, please. Then behind the wholesaler is the manufacturer. And again, the manufacturer makes the drug, but to get it to the wholesaler, there is again a distribution cost and again, a markup. But so far, this side of the equation is pretty much like other consumer goods in terms of, start with the retailer and then the wholesaler and then the manufacturer, right? I mean, that's not that unusual. Where this gets complicated is with the PBM. So let's go to the next slide, please. And the game sort of starts like this. The pharmacy sends a claim to the PBM for that prescription. And the PBM says, nope, sorry, you can't use that drug. We want you to use this other one. And the question is, why is that? Is that clinical or is that financial? And the pharmacist, who may or may not have that particular drug stocked on the shelves, has to go through a process of reconciling what the physician has prescribed and what the PBM wants distributed. And that's a great inefficiency. Okay, that breaks sort of the the flow of things. And if you've ever spent a day behind a pharmacy counter, you will see that the vast majority of prescriptions go through this, what I call broken flow process. It's not like just the patient walks up, gives the prescription, the pharmacist says, oh yeah, I have that, and your PBM approved it, no problem, we'll distribute it, boom. That's why it always takes 15, 20 minutes, sometimes half a day or a day to fill a prescription. Because if the pharmacist has to contact the prescribing physician, that can be a long process. So they finally just they're between the three entities, the pharmacist that has got stock on their shelves, the prescribing physician, and the PBM, they reach agreement, and finally the drug is dispensed. And the PBM pays the pharmacy an agreed upon amount based on a poorly defined, mysterious, and ever-changing MAC list. And MAC stands for Maximum Allowable Charge List. And then they also get paid a dispensing fee. And we're going to talk a little bit about the MAC list here in a bit. Next slide, please. Then the PBM charges the employer the dispensing fee plus the, quote, cost of the drug. But that cost of the drug is based on an entirely different MAC list that has prices that are significantly above that used to pay the pharmacy. And that's called the spread. And so it works like this. Let's go to the next slide, please. So on the MAC list that the PBM used to pay the pharmacy, the drug might be $12. But on the MAC list used to charge the sponsor, that very same drug might be $200. And so the spread that the PBM keeps is $188. So you think you're paying them an administrative fee and that's how they're making their money. But no, they're making money on the spread. And so one of the things we're going to talk about in your contracting is making sure that you are defining the MAC list that is used on both sides of this equation. It has to be a single MAC list, and you need to define it so that it can't be changed that frequently. All right, next slide, please. So on the other side of this, you're going to see rebates and fees, and there's two arrows there. There's one coming from the manufacturer to the PBM and one from the PBM to you. So in addition to spread, the PBM gets paid a rebate from the manufacturer because the PBM arranged that whatever the particular drug is that the manufacturer makes got dispensed in this situation. So they're being rewarded by the manufacturer for doing that. And you all have gotten wise to rebates, and you claim, or you will proudly say, well, we get 100% pass through on our rebates. And you may, but rebates get called a lot of different things. And so that is my concern is the games that get played in contracting affect your ability to get rebates. So let's go to the next slide, please. So if you can see, go ahead and build it. Between 2015 and 2021, rebates as a percent of PBM profit dropped from 27% to 7% because you got wise to their games. But fees and specialty fulfillment grew from 32% to 65%. Go ahead, Amanda, build that. Go ahead and build that out. So let's look at these fees, which are not part of your rebate. This is really important to see. Next, go ahead, Amanda. That's the 32 to 65% on the specialty and on the fees. And I really want you to pay attention to that. That's a big deal. That's from 1/3 to 2/3. Okay, that's a big change in a very short time frame. Next one, please. Go ahead and build this one out too as well. There you go. So here's some of the things we find in contracts. There are, in this one alone, there are 8 different fees, plus they're selling your information. So there's formulary compliance, there's clinical services, there's therapy management services, educational services, My particular favorite is inflation protection programs, medical benefit management services, cost containment programs, discount programs. And as I say below, they are selling your data and making money off of that. And meanwhile, many times, as was in the case with Lehigh Valley was not allowed to see its own data. So that's a big problem. Next slide, please. So as you think about your PBM contract, what you want to make sure is that you have control over the formulary. Can you decide what is going to go on your formulary? Can you cut out wasteful drugs? Can you insist on biosimilars? Can you, independent of the pharmacy, can you use other consultants to help you figure out what drugs are the least cost, most effective drugs, and make sure that those are on your formulary? Do you have control over utilization? Can you control what prior authorizations are approved? So that you're making sure there aren't, again, using independent consultants, can you figure out which biologic drugs or which cancer drugs or which other drugs are equally efficacious but less costly, and get those approved? And do you have control over your network? Can you control the pharmacies in your network? Next slide. And these are some what I call non-negotiables when you're doing your RFP and your contract. You have to insist that that data is yours. You are the fiduciary. And if they are not going to give you your data, then you tell them they are the fiduciary and they have all that responsibility. And I think that will shake them loose a little bit. Being the fiduciary is a big deal, and none of them want to be the fiduciary. So you've got to make that very clear that the data is yours. And it's not that you own it, because saying you own it gets a little bit legally tricky, but you have to have unfettered access to and use of your claims data. You get to pick the auditor. They can't tell you who to use. You get to pick the analytics vendor, a third-party vendor that they can't tell you who to use. You get to pick your data warehouse, and the data are not proprietary because you're paying the bills. They're billing you, you're paying it, which means it's not proprietary to them. It's your data. Insist that 100% of the rebates and other manufacturer fees and discounts are passed back to you. Don't try to name them, because as soon as you name them rebates or you call them inflation protection program or whatever it is you call it, they'll change the name. You just have to be insistent that any fees paid by the manufacturer that go back to the PBM as a result of your claims and of having your lives covered by that PBM belong to you. We've already talked about the MAC. Make sure you specify the date that the MAC list is and the database used, and you use a single MAC for both what you're going to pay and what's going to get paid to the pharmacy. You need clear definitions of generic, preferred brand, reference, and biosimilar. And one of the things we've seen is a single source generic is not a preferred brand, and yet that gets stuck into contracts all the time. It's it's a generic. That's what it is. It may only be manufactured by one place, but it's a generic. It's not a brand. During your RFPs, let the PBM know that you're going to ask them to disclose all fees paid to your consultant and broker for the 12 months prior and during the term of the contract. And let your consultant broker know the same thing, that you're going to ask them to disclose all fees paid to them by the PBM and the TPA for the 12 months prior and during the term of the contract, and reconcile those. Make sure they match, make sure they add up. Next. And assure that the PBM can and will administer all benefit designs, even if you're not currently using them. For example, point of sale rebates. It's sort of bothersome that all the rebates go back to the employer. They may not go back to the person who actually paid the copay or coinsurance on that bill. You want to ensure that you have over-the-counter coverage for select drugs. I'm going to use an example. Duexis is a drug that is a combination of ibuprofen and Pepcid, and it is a $400 prescription. If you get that off of your formulary and you say to your members, but I'll help you buy the ibuprofen and the omeprazole or the Pepcid generic at $20 a month, then you have aligned incentives with yourself and with the plan beneficiary. But if those over-the-counter generics are going to cost them more than their drug copay, they're going to be happy to go ahead with the $400 a month drug because you're paying the bulk of that. They're only paying the copay. So make sure your incentives are aligned. And make sure that you can grandfather for specific drugs during formulary change. In other words, if they change the formulary, you want to be able to not disrupt your members and allow for grandfathering during either specific drugs or a specific time frame or both. You want to have reference pricing for brand over generics. You want to have reference pricing for selected drugs. You want to have benefit differential for specialty drugs. In other words, set up another tier for specialty drugs. You want to have specific out-of-pocket maxes for specific drugs, because some of these drugs are just ridiculously expensive. Now they do amazing things. I mean, we can cure hepatitis C. We can deal with blindness in some cases using drugs. So those drugs are amazing drugs, but you don't want to bankrupt your members that need them. And you want to waive cost share as allowed by law for specific drugs or conditions. And the example I'll use is insulin for diabetics. Insulin is a very inexpensive preventive medication compared to amputation and or the other complications that come out of diabetes. So that's my presentation, and I will turn it over.
Good morning, everybody. This is Rob Berger. I'm hoping that you can see and hear me. So yeah, if you don't mind switching to the next slide, you're going to see some duplicate slides here that I'm going to go through very quickly to buy us back some time. But the message that you should take away from seeing these duplicates is that we are all three of us who created these, 3 or 4 of us that created these slideshows independently, did so and have the same exact, come to the same exact conclusion, and that is we've got a pretty big problem, and that problem is we lost control. So we meaning employers and those who help advise employers, we had the control taken away from us, and we need to take it back. So if you go to the next slide, please. We've already covered some of these things today, like I said, and I'm going to look at it from a slightly different perspective. The situation was cast very well by Anne. Thank you for that, by the way. Good job. Talk a little bit more about the actors and their motivation, and then some solutions and approaches that you can take. I'm going to foreshadow here. John follows me, and John is going to talk about contract in depth. So I'm not going to do that because that's coming down the pike. Instead, what I'm going to do is focus on one particular solution, and that's carving pharmacy away from the medical vendor, and we'll get to that in a moment. So that's what my presentation focuses on. Next slide, please. So you heard some of this. I'm going to say it slightly differently, just to reinforce it. This is a big problem for a few reasons. One of those is that it's in our face. We are all users of this benefit. It's a benefit that's used more than every other benefit combined. Average household prescription count now is somewhere between 3 and 5, depending upon who you believe. We love drugs as a country, and so we find ourselves at the drug counter all the time. The spend is insane. About half of what we spend on healthcare is in drugs, and about half of that is specialty drugs, and about 100% of the commercials you see on TV are specialty drugs. So this is a problem that is totally in our face, and we have to figure out how to get back the control that we lost. Next slide, please. So this is a slightly different version of the same slide you saw before. I'm not going to go through it except to say this: every one of those arrows, every one of those lines that connects the players in the game are opportunities for us to make hay. As the industry tries to connect itself behind the scenes, which is what this slide illustrates, and hide the PBM in the middle of this transaction, our leverage comes from creating cracks in those lines and shining light into those. Next slide, please. This slide shows, again, it's a repeat of an earlier slide, slightly different, but it's the same story as the last slide. The industry is doing everything it can to vertically integrate. So if we take a look just at the first column as an example, CVS Health, which started out as CVS, the drugstore, now owns Aetna. I don't think there's anyone on this call that ever thought the drugstore on the corner would own one of the largest publicly traded insurers on the planet. The drugstore bought the insurance company. So nobody was banking on that. Excuse me, and that's not really enough. CVS also wants to be your doctor. So they have clinics inside of their offices, inside of their drugstores, right? They've been doing vaccinations for a long time. So as these companies, and you can see each one of them as we go down the columns here, as these companies continue to vertically integrate, we should be taking this as a huge warning sign. As they integrate, we need to try to separate, because with integration comes opacity. We lose transparency every time there's an integration. Go to the next slide, please. If you look at just the big three, CVS, Express Scripts, and Optum, each one of them obviously is related to an insurer. CVS owns Aetna, Express Scripts is owned by Cigna, Optum is owned by United Healthcare, United Health Group. They handle 76% of the prescriptions in the United States. They actually handle more than that worldwide, but let's just stay with the United States. So that's not 76% of the prescriptions for employers. That's much higher for the employers. It's 76% of all the prescriptions, and if you include all of the government programs, Medicare, Medicaid, TRICARE, they handle all of it. And so this little oligopoly has control. They're the traffic cop on all these drugs, and it's billions and billions of dollars worth of drugs. So the amount of power that they retain is massive. It therefore makes lots of sense why they would want also to be an insurance company. The insurance company is the bank, right? We give the insurance company our money, and essentially they just turn it around and send it out the door, most of it, and they keep a piece for themselves. We can argue about the piece that they keep, but the truth is most of it goes out the door. So if it's going out the door back to another subsidiary of theirs or another processor of theirs, the PBM, and they don't have any real legal requirement to share the inner workings of that, it makes perfect sense why an insurer and a PBM would want to align. And if you could also be the pharmacy, hip, hip, hooray for you, but not for me and you, not for us. Next slide, please. So there's lots of talk already about this. Again, Ann did a great job. I'm just going to remind you that admin fees are tiny. The stated fees that these PBMs charge for their work is small. The big chunk of money that they make is marking up the cost of drugs. They reimburse the pharmacy at one rate, and they charge you a much higher rate, and they don't disclose it. And that should really annoy you. It annoys me. It motivates me every day. There is no legal requirement for them to expose that number, and they do a very good job of hiding it. On top of that, there are rebates, which are nefarious, and that should really anger you because we pay for the rebates in higher drug costs. So even though we like getting those rebate checks, the truth is those rebates are very bad for all of us because it hides the actual cost of the drugs. And then the last piece is when the PBM also owns the pharmacy, like a mail order or a specialty pharmacy, which they all do, then they get to mark up the cost of the drugs when they buy them. So it's double markup. They mark up the drugs when they buy them, and then they get reimbursed through their own PBM with spread. So hopefully you're annoyed. What can you do? Next slide. Depends where you are on the continuum. If you're like most employers, you're closer to the left than the right. The left side of the continuum is the general place where most of us find ourselves. We buy our medical insurance and our pharmacy coverage through the same vendor. It's been done that way for a long time. It's easier. We'll talk about some of the attributes in a minute, but you know the deal when you buy it and it's all in one card and one phone number. It makes life much simpler. And there really was no reason to separate them historically. But now that pharmacy costs are as high as they are, there is a reason. And so as you move from the left to the right on this continuum, it's the story of separation, of disintegrating, or if you will, carve out, which is the title of this presentation, carving in versus carving out. The integrated approach is called carve in. The completely separated approach is called carve out. And the steps that you see here in the arrows are steps in between. So far left is when you will find yourself carved in and you have no control over the pharmacy at all. That's the highest cost, least control. Far right end of the continuum is when you've carved out pharmacy, you maintain your own contract, and you have full control, or as close to full control as possible. And then I'm going to reiterate what I said earlier. If you look at the bottom of the slide, the whole point of this exercise is to shine light into the darkness of opacity. These sound like grandiose words. They're not. Everything is hidden. You should assume out of the gate that everything is hidden. And so if you take that approach, and this is different than the way you've approached employee benefits in the past. I've been doing employee benefits related stuff for 30 years and selling advice to employers like you for that whole time. And typically it's not this brazen, but the problem has become this brazen. And so we have got to make the assumption that we're not being told the truth and work from that point to try to shine light on it. Next slide, please. So just to get level set here again, some definitions and attributes. Carve in, which is really a crazy dumb term. Can't carve and be in. The carve in is really the integrated approach. It's where the employer maintains a contract with the TPA. And when I say TPA, it could be a carrier as well. If you're fully insured, it's a carrier. If you're self-funded and you happen to be with Aetna, Cigna, the Blues, then they're really acting as a TPA. We call it a carrier, but they're really acting as a third-party administrator. Or you could be with a third-party administrator standalone. Doesn't make a difference. You as the employer contracting with the carrier, the TPA, who then contracts with a PBM, and they usually give you no choice. Right, comes part and parcel with the product, with the medical product. The TPA may or may not own an interest in the PBM. I gave you examples in an earlier slide where CVS, Express Scripts, and Optum, have pretty well-known PBM relationships, but there are plenty of others out there that may or may not be disclosed. And so that means the incentives associated with the relationship between the TPA and the PBM may also not be disclosed. So a big part of my job, our job in this industry, is to identify those incentives and make sure that we are properly handicapping for that. In a carve-in relationship, the focus is historically been on medical. Now that's not necessarily the case because the big money maker is pharmacy. However, medical is often used to cover up the pharmacy story. And we'll talk a little bit about how that works, but it's all economics. You may get a discount on an admin fee for keeping your pharmacy there. Seems subtle until you try to move your pharmacy stuff away. One size fits all. So if you're fully insured or if you're a smaller self-funded group, oftentimes you either have to use the PBM that's associated with the carrier or you are made to feel like you have to. In the case of fully insured, you really don't have a choice in most markets. In the case of self-funded, you do have a choice, but that doesn't mean they'll tell you you have a choice. In fact, they might tell you the opposite. So let's talk about the opposite, carve out. Carve out is very simply defined as the instance where you as the employer contract directly with the PBM. You are taking that control away from the medical vendor and you're creating your own contract. You are picking a PBM based on its own merits. So typically a pharmacy relationship or PBM relationship with a carrier, it's unilateral, right? There's only one. And many, many, many times it's ESI, Optum, CVS. They're generally the ones that are paired up with the big carriers. There are 100 other PBMs now. Everybody wants to be a PBM. Surprise, surprise. There's a ton of money in it. So with 100 choices, being stuck with the big three is not great. You should at least know. There's a focus on pharmacy when you have a PBM contract directly. So you get to tinker, which is good as long as you know how to tinker and you have advice around it. And then you can customize. These solutions are really available. Carve-out solutions are available to anyone who is self-funded. You have various kinds of solutions, but the truth is, once you're self-funded, that door is open no matter what your vendor is currently telling you. Excuse me. The big takeaway here is visibility, right? You want to be able to have visibility into how the plan works. And the way to do that is to create the crack. The crack is carving out. Next slide, please. Thanks. So we'll do a little pro and con thing here. We're going to bounce back and forth from column to column. So you've got one vendor contract. I mentioned that in the last slide. So why is that important? The PBM pieces in your self-funded medical contract may be missing completely. They may be incomplete, or they may be opaque. So what I'm saying is this. If you're carved in right now, you have medical integrated with pharmacy right now, take a look at your ASO contract, the contract that governs the whole relationship. See how many words and numbers that are in that contract are related to PBM, to the pharmacy piece. You may be surprised how few are in there. I can tell you this, if you get your own relationship with a PBM, the contract can be as many as 30 pages long, which is also ridiculous on the other end of the spectrum. But the fact of the matter is, what is not said is all control for the other end of the contract. So if the medical carrier, the TPA, has not said much about the PBM, well, then they do whatever they want. And so thus, there's the control. John's going to talk a lot about the components there. So I'm going to spare you that, but we'll talk more about the attributes here. But do pay attention, because John's got a lot of good advice around how to control the contract once you use a method like this to gain control. So there's one client relationship, one account team is one of the pros of having a carve-in relationship. Same thing for the ID card, the 800 number. There's usually, or at least we're told that there's one claim system. Pay really close attention. Most of the vendors all of the medical vendors outsource their PBM to another entity. They may own that entity, but it's another entity. And so oftentimes the 800 number is a warm transfer to another call center. Most of the time, the claims are at least partly processed on another system. So what we're being told about integration in a carve-in arrangement isn't necessarily true. It's not always false, but it isn't necessarily true. And so you should interrogate that as you go through the process to understand what would change if you were to make a move. Understanding what you have today means you understand the differences in what you'll get tomorrow, or the disruption, I should say. Smaller groups can leverage scale in a carve-in arrangement, right? You're a small group and you go to the Blues, you're going to get the same pharmacy plan as a big group. That's true. But the economics behind the scene may actually be equivalent to the small group subsidizing the large group. The small group may be paying proportionally more behind the scenes than the large group does. So although it looks like you're leveraging scale, you may not be. If you don't have a contract or good reports to obviate that, then odds are the small group is actually subsidizing the large group. Again, interrogate. Out-of-pocket aggregation is a big deal. So if you have a medical plan where both pharmacy and medical accumulate to the same out-of-pocket max, well, that could be interrupted by separating the pharmacy and using another vendor. You've got to get the accumulator file to work. So this is often used as a method to sell against carving out. And that is true. You need to make sure that that's happening. The fact of the matter is, out-of-pocket aggregation is not always integrated with the carrier. And so I've had many instances in my career where the Blues are selected as the medical vendor and the pharmacy vendor, And you wind up having accumulator problems on the pharmacy piece because they're really not talking behind the scenes. We thought they were one entity, but they're really not one entity. Again, it goes back to the claim system. So interrogate, interrogate, interrogate is the name of the game here. The last two are the biggies. So again, I've been doing this for 30 years. It just seems logical. It seems intelligent. It seems intuitive that if you're processing the medical and the pharmacy claims together for medical and pharmacy claims together, and you have the data for all of the medical claims and all of the pharmacy claims, you should be able to do more with that from a medical management perspective, from a specialty pharmacy perspective, right? You have the whole picture. Here's the challenge. In the 30 years I've been doing this, I've seen a stack of white papers as high as I am tall, but I've never seen proof for a particular client that it's working, that keeping the two benefits integrated is actually saving money. So my advice to you here again is interrogate, but also really ask your current vendor, if you're carved in, to provide you some sort of reporting that shows that the pharmacy and the medical claims are being managed together. And basic proof could be this: pharmacy claims are going up, are medical claims going down? Is there an offset? Are drugs being used to prevent surgeries? I'm oversimplifying here, but that's the kind of report that I've been waiting for 30 years that I've not seen. Until I see that, I have to go with the next best solution, which is shine light into the darkness. Next slide, please. So there are many opportunities and a few challenges in all of this. Reiterate, contract control. You want to own the words and the numbers to the extent possible. Baby steps, first get the words and the numbers. If you don't have them today, you want them. Even if you remain with your current vendor, you want to know exactly what governs the relationship. And so demanding a contract or more of a contract than you have today is almost always the right prescription, pardon the pun. Data. I know Ann talked about this already. It's insane that the data is yours, but you don't get it and they get to sell it, right? I mean, that's the takeaway from Ann's speech about data. It's nuts, but it's totally true. I'm going to take it a step further. Once you have the data, assuming you're lucky enough, can you do anything with it? Is it actionable? So getting the data first, making sure that the data is relevant, and making sure you know what to do with the data, which usually involves getting some kind of outside help, is the first step. And then the next step is make sure you can do something with it. You don't want to become an informed idiot. Economic transparency becomes one of the biggest benefits of all when you consider carving out. You don't have to carve out to do this, but going down the path, shining light into that crack opens up an entirely new world. A new world of acronyms, of course. The way the PBM makes money, right? Is the PBM making money by marking up the cost of drugs? If they are, then what's the elixir? There are vendors out there who will just charge a fee, kind of like a TPA. What does that mean for you? You need to evaluate it. How about the drugs themselves? How are they priced? So there's a cockamamie method that we use today, which uses a basis that has no real basis in reality, AWP. We've got other solutions around that. Rebates become a point of negotiation as well. You've got additional vendors that you can access once you own the contract and own control to manage specialty pharmacy, prior authorization. We can talk more about that at another time. I think we're running low on time here. Formulary control. Ann mentioned Duexis. There are 100 drugs on your formulary right now that are not medically necessary. Nobody's ever told you that. I'm telling you. You need to get rid of them, but you need control to do that. Next slide, please. Reporting. Once it's all out on the table, you want to make sure that you get ongoing reports. That becomes an option as well when you carve out. You're probably not getting much by way of reporting today. Competition is the key. So opening the door to competition is what's going to change the game for you, at least in the short run, economically. And the only way to really create competition and drive down costs with the incumbent is to start down the path of carving out. So I'm gonna wrap up, I think, on this slide. Because That's really the most important thing I have to say. This is a healthy process. Understanding carve out is a super healthy process because it'll make you acquainted with what's really going on in the plan, what they don't want you to know, and will give you the leverage to negotiate with the incumbent. Two things to be aware of. Penalties come in lots of flavors. So make sure that you really interrogate your current arrangement to understand what penalties are involved should you actually decide to carve out. And then the last piece is data integration. We talked about the out-of-pocket accumulator. I think I'm going to end here because we're out of time. I've got a couple of examples and we can talk a little bit later if you have questions about those. Thank you.
I think I'm up. Hi, this is John Adler. First, I'd like to thank Lehigh Valley for allowing me this opportunity. And secondly, thank you to all the participants for hanging with this entire presentation. What you're essentially seeing and hearing is probably 6 hours of tutorials on the subject of PBM contracting and the dynamics of the industry. And thanks to Ann and Rob for both doing a beautiful job of laying out the dynamics and structure of the industry. Just a couple of, before I begin, and I promise I'll be brief because I figure by now people may be reaching their absorption points. I always like to say, you know, your head starts spinning around like Linda Blair in The Exorcist. Hopefully most of us are old enough to remember that movie. But a couple of things very quickly. I mean, when I look at the Lehigh Valley audit and, you know, contracting, there's some overall strategies from contracting. One is to maximize the accountability of the PBM and the auditability of the contract. Clearly, whatever the contract was that Lehigh County signed did not have that feature, the auditability feature in it. The other piece is to minimize disputes by clearly defining all the terms, definitions in the contract itself. Last but not least, every contract that is done should include an audit protocol addendum where the protocols for the audit are clearly laid out. And one of the most critical of those is not a sample audit. To Ann and Rob's points about owning your own data, you have to really insist that it's what we call a full file audit. And one of the reasons for that, I think a clear example would be that let's say they do a sample. Let's say they do 5% of the claims or 300 claims, which is very typical. I mean, think about 300 claims in the context of your total drug claims annually. And what you have here is a situation where, let's say, oops, we missed that bright, shining single specialty med that was supposed to be priced at $50,000 and it was priced at $100,000. So I think specialty and the rise of specialty claims is really demanding that we do full file audits. This also leads to you owning your own claims data, which, as Ann indicated, you very clearly should. So there's a couple of other things here. Yeah, have we lost control? Yeah, I don't want to be Chicken Little, but 50% of your specialty spend is probably coming through your medical side. And if you folks think that it's really out of control on the RX side of your benefit, take a look at the medical side of your benefit. And again, that's another discussion entirely. So consolidation is equaling a lack of competition, which equals a lack of transparency, which equals a lack of leverage and ultimately higher prices for all of us, the people that I like to say are paying the check. So where are we? This is going to fit perfectly, I think, because I'm actually going to go into some very specific terms, conditions, and definitions that I think, along with everything else you've heard previously, will make sense to you. So if we go to the next slide, that'd be terrific. So here are some wild and crazy things that need to be defined in your contract. First, drug reclassification. There's many ways for a PBM to reclassify a drug from a generic to a brand in order to increase their profit margin and the cost of the plan sponsor, which also helps them make their guarantees. And where these reside typically are in what we call DAW 5 and 9 codes. which dispensed as written. 5, without getting into the technical means of those, just that's something you need to be very aware of, and talk with whoever your consultant is about clearly defining where DAW 5 and 9 code claims are placed in your guarantees. Then there's generic drug classification. In addition to single source generics, which Ann addressed earlier, there are 3 other types of generics that can be moved around on the chessboard into the brand bucket. And it's pretty intuitive. You take minus 80 generic drugs and you put them into a minus 25 brand bucket, it helps a PBM make their guarantees. So there's new to market, single source generics, new to market, patent litigated, and limited supply generics. All of these need to be defined in your RFP search and in your contract in terms of where are those bucketed. And then point of sale rebates. Point of sale rebates, if you notice, maybe you didn't, but we in the industry certainly did, that the PBMs and the manufacturers really didn't push back on point of service rebates. Well, there's a reason for that. Being able to clearly define the 100% of the rebates attributable comes down to the following. As Ann and Rob both indicated, there's more than just rebates in what you're receiving in rebates. What we should really talk about is manufacturer revenue. And you as a plan sponsor negotiating 100% of manufacturer revenue, because technically there's only 2 forms of rebates. There are 14 other forms, and maybe more, probably more. I haven't looked at our most recent RFP, maybe 16 other forms of compensation that PBMs receive from manufacturers. Then outside of that is the deepest, darkest hole of all, which is called off-invoice discounts, which really aren't discounts, but are in fact a way to get additional money to PBMs from the manufacturers without violating best cost practices for the Department of Defense and the Veterans Administration, which are protected by law. So if your head wasn't spinning before, it probably will be now. Here's another thing, rebates based on day supply. We're starting to see a push for 90-day scripts for specialty. Why is that interesting? It's interesting from 2 perspectives, both from a utilization management and best practices perspective, because PBMs have touted for years that they only dispense specialty in 30-day supply. I mean, think about this. What if somebody gets a 90-day supply of a specialty med, and all of a sudden after 15 days or 20 days, it's not working the way it's supposed to? 60 days of that script go into the trash can, and the employer still pays for it. And at a cost, a 90-day script for specialty would be a minimum of $15,000 to $20,000. You can do the math on what that would actually cost in terms of waste. Then this is a pretty simple one, audit recovery retention. You should receive 100% of the retail pharmacy audit recoveries on your behalf. Next, please. Less than 84-day supply fills at mail order. It's very popular for PBMs to say, slip this into their contract language, where if it's less than an 84-day supply, the plan sponsor will receive the retail pricing and rebates. And that's pretty easy to spot, but it could be fairly hidden. So you need to define that very clearly. HIV and transplant medications, PBMs like to classify. If you don't ask them how they classify these, they will classify these typically as a non-specialty medication to avoid paying a specialty rebate. And right now, we're seeing a difference between non-specialty mail order and specialty. The rebates are typically for mail order about $650 to $700 per mail order script versus $2,000 or more for the rebate on a specialty script. So you can see there's a huge gap and a huge difference between those two. Specialty medication classification. We have 5 different types of specialty meds. EDD is exclusive distribution drugs. LDD is limited distribution drugs. Biosimilars, as Ann mentioned, generics. The generics and biosimilars are different, by the way, in classification and specialty, and then what I call garden variety, like Humira. And how are they defined and how are they bucketed? Because what can happen is we looked at a PBM who was way outside of the industry standard in terms of defining limited distribution drugs. And limited distribution drugs in the contract had a discount of minus 11.5, where specialty non-limited distribution had a discount of minus 19. So this is really important to define them and how they're bucketed. Manipulating and taking spread and compound claims, that's really small potatoes in terms of the number of compound claims, but this is important to just say to the PBM, okay, you're not allowed to mark up compound claims. We want those to come to it at the cost that as they come into the system, as they're adjudicated. Next, please. NDC switching, this has been around forever, since the Dead Sea was alive. Switching the last 2 digits of the NDC code to a larger package size. There's 4 different AWPs for each drug, depending on package size. It's intuitive that the 100 unit AWP is greater than the 5,000. It's economies of scale. So just make sure that you're protected on that, and that's not allowed. Market share fees, PBMs get paid. This is another mechanism from the manufacturers. Management fees, a manufacturer administrative fee, it's typically between 4 to 4.5% of each drug's AWP, or it can be based on WAC, wholesale acquisition cost. Either way, it's a lot of money. I mean, if you think about this logically, the AWP on, I'll just choose Lipitor or Nexium, which would probably the AWP on that is probably for a mail order script, is somewhere in the neighborhood of $1,000. So 4 to 4.5% of just that on manufacturer administration fee is between $40 and $45. Make sure the manufacturer administrative fee, along with as many of the other elements as possible that are being paid to the PBM, are included in your rebate guarantees. And by the way, you really have to define which one of those revenue elements are included, because if you ever decide to audit rebates, if you don't have that on the front end and defined and included as part of the RFP, and that is then attached to the contract, ideally, you'll get just going to circle on any rebate audit. Mail auto refill, boy, diabetic test strips are great to autofill every 90 days because there's very few members who use all of their test strips. So this is a huge waste. Driving around New Jersey, I remember seeing on telephone poles, got test strips and a number. So there's a black market because of this. Next, please. Repackaging and relabeling under FDA regulations, PBMs and drugstores and wholesalers are allowed to repackage any drug and create their own AWPs, and those are higher than those published and for the drug and Metaspan. What does that mean to you? It means you get this bright, shiny discount of minus 80, but the starting point for that discount is $120 instead of $100. So make sure that this is not allowed in the PBM contract. Mail copay waiver, I don't think people even know this exists, where, well, on this one you do, but there's another form of waiver. But waiving a mail order generic copay is not necessarily the best idea. It just depends on how that works. But the other mail copay waiver is where your members haven't paid 100% of the cost of their drugs. PBMs will continue to ship those drugs until that unpaid amount reaches typically $100. And in all these contracts, this is not addressed, but guess who's responsible for paying that if it doesn't get paid? It's you, the plan sponsor. So negotiate that out and say that PBM's responsible for any member non-payment at mail order. Rebate manipulation, we're seeing classes of drugs being excluded from receiving rebates, so it allows a PBM to take what they are receiving, subsidize what they are paying in terms of brand drugs, maybe now 800 instead of 1,000 because they're not paying on multi-source brand drugs or some other form, and they're able to express a higher guarantee to look better in a competitive bid. But in fact, they're simply taking classes of drugs and not paying you, despite the fact that they're receiving those rebates from the manufacturer. Next, please. Rebate retention. We've seen PBMs that establish a company between themselves and the manufacturers. They pull 20 to 30% of the rebates off in that middle company they own, and they're not disclosing. And then they're paying you 100% of what they receive, but they're not telling you they've already scraped 20 to 30% off. and keeping it for themselves. So that can dilute what you're getting in rebates. Collecting OTC, there are rebates being paid on OCT drugs. And we talked earlier, both Rob and Ann talked about what we call low clinical value drugs, which are these drugs like Duexis. They're actually, Rob, I appreciate that, 100. We've actually got that up to 135. And they're really popular because the PBM is making incredible, typically the rebates on those, like Duexis, which is about $3,000 a script. There's a 70% rebate paid to the PBM, which they use to subsidize or keep for themselves. Insulin rebates, really important to get rebates for insulin. Non-formulary rebates, same thing, get rebates for non-formulary drugs. Again, that's another one of the classes of drugs that can be excluded. Next, please. Diabetic test strips rebates, tremendous amount of rebates on diabetic test strips. Manipulating device claims, there's 501k claims, which are for devices that have an NDC number, actually durable medical equipment. And these may not have a negotiated brand or generic discount, so they can be billed at whatever cost the PBM wants to assign. Make sure, and this might be fairly obscure, but it really is one of those areas where a penny here and a penny there, and suddenly you've got a nickel that you need to be aware of. And no pass-through of UNC claims. These need to be passed through. Usual and customary is the cash price, which is typically better or should be better than the negotiated fees that a person would pay if they walked in and paid cash. Next, please. Almost finished, folks. I know this is a lot. Reclassifying generics as brands. This is very common. You need to prohibit this. Zero balance due, make sure they're not included at 100% discount, just whatever the negotiated discount is. Otherwise, that can bump up the ability to make a discount guarantee and should be allowed. Next, please. Full file claims audit, we talked about that. Termination files at no cost. We're seeing typically $3,500 to $4,000 fees per file, and there's typically 4 files that are necessary. You can do the math on what that would cost you, and yes, maybe it's covered under an implementation fee with your new PBM, but it can still add up very, very quickly, and it robs that money from the implementation fee for anything else that you want. Next, please. No ceiling for pharma. Earlier, price inflation clauses in rebate contracts. This is where if a manufacturer increases the price by, let's say, 10%, it triggers an equivalent amount of rebates coming to the PBM that offsets that price increase. Those should be passed along to you, which helps defeat price inflation. Multiple max lists, already talked about that, which is pretty interesting. Right to terminate without cause after the first year and if the PBM is acquired by someone else. Next, please. That's it. So thank you so much, folks. I appreciate it. I know that's a lot in a very short period of time.
Hi, this is Colleen. I am here to give you a quick legislative update. I know we're running short on time, so I'll try to go through these slides relatively quickly. Can we go to the agenda slide? So there's basically 2 major pieces of legislation that have been passed in the last several months that will affect plans and healthcare in general. So we'll go through a couple of high-level outcomes from each of those. But again, these are large pieces of legislation, so there's no possible way I can cover everything. I'm happy to try to take questions at the end, though. Move on. Great. So the Consolidated Appropriations Act, this is the big, huge spending bill that was signed at the end of last year. It's $2.3 trillion total. That includes a lot of stuff. This is a regular funding bill. So this is a funding bill that includes appropriations for all government agencies, including a lot of healthcare related things and including a lot of COVID relief related things. So the 3 things I was going to touch on here are the No Surprises Act, the transparency requirements, and then there are some provisions related to COVID testing, contact tracing, and vaccines. On the next slide, we have some highlights from the No Surprises Act is contained within the CAA. I think everybody who has been following this issue knows that there has actually been several pieces of legislation related to surprise billing that have been floating around the Hill for almost 2 years at this point. different versions, tweaking different things, but this is the one that ended up in there. This was a very last minute addition. We didn't have a lot of time to try to influence how this happened. The main concepts to pull out here are that it basically covers the situation in which somebody, an enrollee, insured individual, goes into care at a network facility, but during the course of what happens there, they end up getting treated by out-of-network providers that they wouldn't have had any reason to know about or research in advance. So those are definitely the most common situations in which people get surprise bills, and so that's what this is trying to address. It's not perfect, and we hope to continue to influence the regulatory process for how this rolls out. So the main thing here was, and what everybody agreed on, was to hold patients harmless, like stop sending these bills to the patients. So that's what this does. There's requirements for how quickly you have to bill and how you can send, like who kind of, where the paperwork goes, I'll say. On the next slide. This is the part that we weren't super excited about, the IDR process. So quickly, cost sharing requirements. The plan can't, no matter what happens, the patient can't get stuck for more than what they would have paid under their cost sharing agreement is if it was an in-network provider. So that's the only way that a patient gets sort of caught up in this. But the main chunk of this, and the part that we tried really hard to influence not to be the solution, was the use of arbitration to settle these disputes. So we really pushed for a median in-network rate. That didn't happen. So the situation here is that we have this arbitration system to figure out. And I'm sure you all have questions about how this is actually going to be implemented. I can tell you I do too. There's not a lot yet in terms of the detail, but the way that this is set up is basically it's people refer to it as a baseball style arbitration. If you're familiar with that system, the arbitrator gets offers from both sides, the plan and the provider, and has to pick one. So there's lots of guardrails in the law around who and how and when and where you use arbitration, but there's still a lot more detail that will have to come out in regulations. On the next slide are some transparency provisions. I won't read every one of these, but there are several sort of, I guess I might characterize them as a seemingly random list of various transparency provisions that have been, again, floating around in the policy world for a while now. So, there's a lot more requirements placed on plans. And my piece of advice here for whoever wants advice is talk to get with your contracts people, figure out whether or not this stuff is in your contracts for the upcoming plan year. Make sure that you are aware of what needs to happen here, because the requirement runs to the plan. Obviously, if you're using ASO, TPA, whatever else arrangements you have, it's really up to the plan sponsor to make sure that everything is outlined clearly in a contract. So definitely take a look at these. The next slide. There's just a bunch more money for COVID-19 related work. So again, I won't read all of these, but a large portion was to get money out there kind of more on the ground, I guess I would say, as opposed to previous COVID relief. A lot of this money is meant to flow down into local communities, go straight to vaccine distribution, vaccine administration places, and to really help kind of fill in some of the gaps that still exist related to how badly COVID taxed our healthcare system. The next slide, we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about the American Rescue Plan Act. This is the one that was just signed a couple weeks ago. This is a COVID relief bill. Unlike the other one, it's not a full government funding bill. And healthcare wasn't a huge focus in it, but there are a few things in there that I thought were especially important for this audience. So I'll go through those three on the next couple slides. First one is about the COBRA subsidies. So this is another thing that sort of has been floating around since COVID started, really, is how to make sure that COBRA was filling in whatever gaps it was able to fill in. And so the law sets up 100% premium subsidy for people who are eligible for COBRA, and explains a little bit further about what additional types of populations are going to be eligible for COBRA. This particular expansion of COBRA. You'll see here, it's very time limited. It can start for coverage months earlier than April 1st, but no later than September 30th. So this is a temporary provision meant to just kind of, again, help bridge some gaps for people who might still be falling through the cracks in terms of coverage. The one thing I mentioned too here is that you the employer pay it, and then you're reimbursed on your taxes. That's the way that they actually have the money set up to flow. And again, I'm sure people have questions about that. More regulations are supposed to be coming out to help figure out how this is actually going to be implemented. Sorry, you can move to the next slide now. The law also expands eligibility for marketplace premium tax credits. So this is the way that most people get financial subsidies to help pay for the healthcare that they purchase on a marketplace or exchange. Those terms are interchangeable, by the way. So they're increased the eligibility in terms of who can get subsidies and then what the subsidies are, to try to make sure that people aren't falling through the cracks. So these are increased in percentages of federal poverty level that you are eligible for the tax credit. So this might affect people, like if you are in an industry where you might have people kind of on that cusp who might be eligible for marketplace coverage and or your employer coverage. You know, there's ways to make sure that you're aware of what the eligibility requirements are here. So if you think this might affect you, I would definitely take a look here too. And again, this is temporary. This is intended to be temporary. So for tax years 2021 and 2022 at this point. The next slide is a quick, another just sort of more money out the door for COVID. This is, I think the main thing here that was really kind of debated pretty hotly was this Defense Production Act. I'm sure people have heard about the Defense Production Act and how it can be used in this context. It was just another tool that was available to Congress, and so they decided to pull the trigger this time around and allocate some funding for their funding to be used under the Defense Production Act. So, and again, just more money towards vaccines, distribution of vaccines, administration of vaccines, and tracking and tracing, just to make sure that we're continuing to make progress there. So I think that might be the last slide. Yep. So thank you everybody. I know that was really quick, so happy to take questions too.
Colleen, we're going to invite everyone back on camera.
Okay.
We have one question out there right now. If John and Rob will join us, great. So our first question was in the chat, but I think we'll go through it in more detail. So we had a self-funded client who mentioned their carrier is no longer going to allow pharmacy to be carved out. Told them they either have to use the RX coverage through the medical plan or they have to change medical coverage to retain the carve out. So I know, John, you took a shot at answering that first, if you want to go over that for the audience, and then Rob, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, this actually plays right into Ann and Rob's comments about the power of carving in. It's an inevitability this would happen because as we've seen the vertical integration and consolidation, and by the way, CVS Caremark is also buying doctors' practices. So that's another piece of the integration. What I would do is you need to investigate, go out to market for another medical carrier, looking for equivalent discounts with maybe one of the other national carriers that doesn't require that. They will all, I think, eventually do that, maybe not. But in the meantime, do separate searches for both a new medical carrier and a PBM to take advantage and leverage. And you know what? You can tell Highmark that, look, this is what I'm going to do. If you're going to say it's my way or the highway, then I'm taking all this out to bid. That would be my suggestion.
Yeah, I would echo John's astute points, and because I'm a little more irritated in life in general, I would say this, because the player is Highmark. Well, first, let's level set. I would be pissed off if they're telling you they'd rather have none of your business than lose the secret pharmacy profit, the secret drug profit. That's what they're saying to you. So in this particular case, because we know it's Highmark, you've got an absolutely wonderful deal through the coalition for capital on the medical side. And you might want to remind Highmark of that when you ask to insert carve-out rights into your contract right now. You need to play hardball with them because they're playing hardball with you. So definitely leverage. Well, first of all, understand that you have the Capital Blue Cross relationship through the coalition, and that it's a great deal. And then use that either as your out or as leverage to include carve-out rights in your contract now. I don't know the size of your group. I don't know any of the details, but that's generally the angle I take.
And I would completely agree with what they have said. I got nothing to add. You got to play hardball when they play hardball. Don't go weak-kneed. You need a spine of titanium to stand up.
And Amanda, I'm going to jump in. I don't usually do this. First of all, I want to thank all the presenters for a great discussion. But specific to that question, the coalition has been taking an approach over the last few years when we select purchasing partners, that instead of selecting one partner for each of our areas, for example, pharmacy, last year we did an RFP for pharmacy, and instead of having Express Scripts as our only partner, as we have historically, we now have Express Scripts and Welldyne. So our members have a choice, and if there's a repricing they're looking for, they can get side-by-side independent repricings. But specific to the medical, in Rob's point, right now we have a really great deal with Capital. I'm not sure that the questioner may not be in the capital market area, but again, we've taken an approach with medical to provide choice and recently announced a partnership with AmeriHealth Administrators. So if Capital does not cover your market area, we can connect you with AmeriHealth, and they'll, again, an option to talk to. There's no commitment, there's no cost or anything else. And it's interesting, we've talked about carved in, carved out. AmeriHealth talks about carving up. And what you can do with them as a TPA, you can bring in services around their TPA services and select and choose whatever you want to do. So if there's an interest, please let us know and we can connect you with that. I apologize for jumping in on that, but I just wanted to comment on the opportunity for choice with the coalition. Thank you.
Okay, and that is the only question we have received. Does anyone else have a question they'd like to submit? We can keep it open for another minute or so. And I think with that, we are coming up on time. So just like to thank everyone for joining us today. Thank all of our presenters for being here. Again, this recording will be made available. And thank you again. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thanks.